Did Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our long-awaited Saturday book, Book 3, Volume 3 of Dolores Cannon's trilogy, Conversations with Nostradamus. Before I start, entertainment purposes only. Everything in this video and in the subsequent videos about this book, it's all purely a synopsis of the book. These are the words of Nostradamus, not me. And he lived in the 1500s, so good luck trying to get him in trouble. Let's get right to it. I know everybody's been really waiting for this. I got a lot of positive input about the other two books. And I personally think that this book is the most significant because I think it speaks to a lot of what's happening right now. So Book 3, published in 1992, but based on hypnosis regressive sessions done from early to mid-80s on. So Section 1 is called The Search. Chapter 1, The Adventure Will Not Cease. So by 1987, so I think she did it for 4 years roughly, so probably about 83 it started. This seemed like the end of her conversations. Her relationship with Nostradamus, he was stern and impatient with all ignorance, with stupidity. But he also had a sense of humor, and he could be very loving, but he was much a person out of place with his own time. She needed subjects who could achieve a deep trance. Not anyone could do this. And would be able to translate for her, not literally translate from another language, but explain to her what was being told to the subject, the hypnotic subject. And it had to be somebody willing to do it, because what's the first big rule? You don't do anything to force somebody against their free will. And she really didn't. She trod a very thin line sometimes, but she didn't do that. She felt very lucky that she had found 3 people who had been really good to work with, but they had all had to move on. She felt her task with Nostradamus was incomplete, but she set it aside because she couldn't find anybody to work with, and she had a lot of other simultaneous projects. She had promised Nostradamus that she would do his last quatrains, that they would do all of them, and she had only done about half at this point. But the project was in limbo. But Nostradamus reassured her of something. He said, we won't lose contact. Now remember, he's speaking through a hypnotically regressed subject. That he wouldn't lose contact, that he'd come through somebody that she worked with. So after John left, now John was the young man who was the astrologer who moved to Florida, tragically died of AIDS a couple of years later. After he left, she began working with Move On, which took her away from the whole thing about Nostradamus for a couple of years. In 1989, her publisher started pushing her to do Volume 3. And she told the publisher, this is not up to me. I need a good subject. If I don't have a good subject, I can't do it at all. She wasn't really enthusiastic about the whole thing because it was so much work. And she got in the mail from her publisher. These are the old days, when people did catalogs. And the publisher sent her the 1989 catalog of books coming up. And under the description of her book, Book 1, the publisher had said, was the first of a possible 3 books. And she felt, all right, she felt a bit coerced, but also her curiosity was re-sparked. So Chapter 2, The Search begins. She needed a somnambulist, as we talked about in the first 2 books. For some reason, somnambulists, people who sleepwalk, tend to be better subjects for this particular sort of contact. So she had a couple of people she knew, and that had worked with her for years and had been volunteers numbers of times for different experiments that she was doing with her other projects. And we're going to look at some other of her books eventually, and we'll, I'm sure, encounter them again. But Nostradamus had made it really clear that he preferred to work with a man. Nostradamus was, and I'm sure still is, a misogynist, a product of his time. This made it hard because most of her really good subjects were women, and women tended to be more intuitive in Dolores Cannon's experience. But she had this guy called Phil that she'd worked with for 5 years, and he was an excellent channeler. He was a young guy who worked in electronics, and so because of his particular intellectual bent, he was good with codes and symbols, and she needed that. He identified as a star person. This is somebody who is incarnated on Earth for the very first time and had previously been either in other planets or other dimensions. But he had a problem doing this work with Nostradamus, going into it, because, I mean, he was willing, but he was worried because he was very easily distressed by negative messaging, the negative stories, that things I hear back from everybody here. You know, it's so hard to hear. Some people have a harder time hearing it than others, and he particularly felt the pain of what was going on. And it remained after he came out of his trance state, and it caused him to be depressed for weeks. So she knew that it would be impossible for him to work with the negative aspects of Nostradamus's predictions, but she didn't tell him who they were trying to reach. She told him it was somebody in the past, and she decided that if he was able to connect, that maybe they would find a way to work with Nostradamus without focusing on the negative messaging. So through Phil, she communicated with what was called a Council of 12. This is some spirit thing. And Phil went under. He experienced a sense of light all around him. There was an atmosphere of safety. She was told that Phil would not be able to transport himself to the plane that was necessary to do a face-to-face thing with Nostradamus, as some of the other subjects had been able to do, but that he would be able to communicate telepathically. This Council of 12 told her that the energy was incompatible for Phil to go on to Nostradamus's plane. And I don't fully understand this myself. You have to be at a certain vibratory level to be able to connect with other vibratory levels, is the basic idea. Phil was helped by this council to visualize Nostradamus, and it worked. He was able to connect. What he saw was an old man in a room. He described the very familiar room. He saw him sitting in front of a mirror on a table and looking at recipes for tonics and elixirs. So he was doing his medicine thing. Nostradamus saw Phil and was fascinated to see him. But it wasn't new for him to see the manifestations of spirits from other times and places. So imagine, didn't surprise him. And he realized almost immediately that this had to do with their previous work on the quatrains with people from the 20th century. He knew this. So he said he was pleased to see Phil. He asked for John, how John was. So this immediately, Dolores is beginning to feel like, okay, we've made an authentic contact. Nostradamus says, oh, my light's trying to go out. I wonder if my power is going out. Nostradamus says that at that time that he wouldn't discuss the past, that he was being cautious. He was reluctant. I mean, he thought that he was dealing with the same people, spirits, but he had to be sure. So he was not going to be saying a lot of revelatory stuff till he was sure. Nostradamus's experience of this contact was that he saw Phil as a shimmering light that in front of him trying to materialize. And he could sense a higher order, but he was still wary of spirit entities because he had sort of opened a door and never knew what he was going to get. He wasn't wanting to discuss his prophecies until he was convinced of the purpose of this specific materialization. So Canon says that Nostradamus originally contacted them to clarify the prophecies. He wanted to initiate the first contacts to divert the worst outcomes, to try to get the message clear in people's heads, because they were so poorly translated and so misunderstood, and that he had done the initial contacting, and he wanted his knowledge to be helpful, that he had disguised them to keep themselves safe, to keep them safe and passed down through time, so that they'd be a help for people who got the message when they would be able to understand and utilize the message. But it was also to protect himself. He would be blamed. If people knew he could predict the future and he did and it was bad, he would be blamed. He would be burned as a witch. But he was still cautious, and he said he needed to develop a certain amount of rapport with Phil. He was hesitant. He needed absolute trust. Phil says that Nostradamus looked like maybe he was in his 30s, not as old as he originally thought. He describes him. He says he's married, but he doesn't think his wife is very smart. Nostradamus does not think his wife is very smart. He did not hold women in very high esteem. He was more interested in his work than in his family, and in medicine, not in the prophecies at first. Canon asks Phil to go to an older time for Nostradamus when he was actively involved in the prophecies. And Nostradamus said, come back later, send the boy, Phil. Come back later. So at the end of the session, Phil remembered Nostradamus in the room, and he said that Nostradamus was wary that others might be trying to find out about his work, like a war of the magicians. Lots of weird stuff going on here. So in the next week, Phil had a very strange experience in his own life. For 3 days after the session, he said that he could feel Nostradamus in his presence, that there was a sort of a telepathic link. Each knew what the other was thinking. Canon didn't want this going on. Phil was a neutral observer. He was curious about Nostradamus. Nostradamus was curious about what was going on in the 20th century. He was actually using Phil to see things like magazines and TVs, that kind of thing, through Phil, which of course, you would be interested, right? But anyway, they had some sort of frequency link that they didn't really understand each other's words, but it was all telepathic. But now Nostradamus was feeling comfortable with Phil and Phil's agenda, and knew he was associated with Canon, and it was safe. And before she put Phil under for the next session, she said, if he tells you negative things, are you going to be able to handle this? He said, I don't see how it could get much worse already. Now, keep in mind, he's talking in terms of the late 80s. Acid rain, nukes, politics, that would be upsetting, but I think I can handle what he shows me. So in the next session, Nostradamus was actually not in the room. Some other entity was, and Phil couldn't make contact with it. He tried to find Nostradamus, and when he did find him, Nostradamus was barefoot on the deck of a boat and looked much younger than he had the last time they spoke. Phil couldn't make contact. This was Nostradamus as a very young man before he developed his abilities, and he had not opened his mind yet. The next attempt at a later age for Nostradamus was also difficult because other spirits had been bugging Nostradamus and he was trying to prevent communication. So he was putting up a block. There are incarnate and interfering spirits on the spirit plane, and they seem slightly previous to Canon's time. Like, she didn't say specifically, but I'm thinking, 1800s or something. Anyway, Phil eventually made contact, and Nostradamus said that his quatrains had been mistranslated a long time ago, and his goal in life was to help to clear it up. The puzzles of the quatrains were to protect them and him, but also to keep information from less knowledgeably evolved people where they could cause chaos, that people weren't ready to hear them for a long time and they needed to remain obscure. And now we're ready. We need to hear them. And Nostradamus is able to hear telepathically Phil. He says he's had experiences with mischievous entities who give false information, therefore he has to be very careful. He says it's just personal mischief, but it's simple troublemakers in the spirit plane, and he has no time for them. He says the intent of a communication can't be hidden, that their primary motives have to be laid bare. They have to be really honest with each other. He says he's in communication with his own higher self on other levels. I don't understand that, but okay. So anyway, they do a quatrain, and he predicts a terrorist act with biocontamination of the water supply. That the people who do this will be traveling with false Hindu passports. I don't know what that means. So Phil came out of his trance and he felt somebody was blocking the communication with Nostradamus. He said the psychic weather is bad. It might be that the messages were just on too low of a vibratory level for Phil to handle. So Phil was not able to work with Nostradamus. It was just all too negative and too internalized in trance. And Dolores said that, the welfare of her subjects is always her first concern, and she couldn't push him into it. I mean, she didn't want to push him into it. So she decided she would eventually have Phil work with Nostradamus, specifically only about future technology. But first they had to finish the quatrains. Chapter 3, the search continues. So while doing MUFON UFO stuff, she met a woman named Cynthia. She asked Cynthia if she would try an experiment, and Cynthia was perfectly willing. So she took her into a trance between her lives. Now, remember that they've done that. They regress from life to life, so you could do past life regressions. But there's also time between incarnations, and you can access that too. Cynthia was confused because it is life, but it's just between physical life. Message being, you don't die, you just change form. This confused her subconscious to be telling her to go between lives, because that's a contradiction. It wasn't between lives. And so Canon had to change her wording. Cynthia found herself in a euphoric state in a place of lights. She saw that she was wearing a white robe, and it felt really good to have no burden of a body along. She says, I can go to so many places, and it's peaceful. And I'm here creating cycles for myself. I'm still progressing and deciding about my next incarnation. She was asked, could she converse with Nostradamus? And she said she would go to a temple with ultimate bright beings of the universe that could help. She describes a building like a Greek building with the wisdom and truth of the ages inside of it. She's approached by an old bearded male, an adept master, all-knowing. Similar beings had helped John. He called them guardians, masters, teachers. They were benevolent, helpful, bound by the regulations that they sternly enforced. Suddenly, Cynthia hears a new gruff voice who asks her who's asking. And Canon is asked Cynthia to speak with Nostradamus. And they hear this disincarnate voice saying she's protected, there's no harm. So there's layers of, security. So finally Nostradamus speaks, and he says he was born clairvoyant, but as a young adult he used incarnations and created a higher energy that he travels through, and the information has always been accurate, that he is, and then they are told, Cynthia is told, that Nostradamus is a holy one connected to the source that we all come from, that he is a part of the divine. He says he has his own clairvoyance, but a channeling message, but also is channeling messages from a higher source to help mankind. So he is able to do it himself, but he's also receiving information from elsewhere. Part of him is communicating with himself and using him as a tool to help us. So Man has clairvoyant abilities, is what his message is. You get them when you're ready for them. Nostradamus says that he uses the mirror too, that he can actually physically walk into it. We're talking Alice in Wonderland stuff, literally. He was taught by a higher being. It has a spell on it. And with other mirrors, but without the right incantation, you could get stuck. So don't go experimenting with your makeup mirror. He says he spends most of his time alone, and he's considered strange, a hermit. His prophecy that what little people know is considered heretical, so he's very careful. He has one great student with abilities. Many try, and they're curious, but they're lazy, or they don't have abilities. He's a harsh judge. He also teaches medical students who have lots of interest in alchemy, and medicine uses alchemy in those days. Cynthia had to quit. Her allergy medications interfered with her ability to get clear messages. Brenda had some of that same problem too. But really what it boiled down to is Nostradamus said he would feel more comfortable with a male. But because women are better at attaining and working in altered states, that would usually be Canon's choice. But she was a little relieved when Cynthia backed out because working with her just wasn't feeling right. Regressive subjects often continue to get past life impressions after their trance when they're asleep at night for a few days, and they're told to pay attention to your dreams. So Cynthia had a dream. She told Canon about it 6 months later because it didn't occur to her that it was important. She wrote it down the morning after she had the dream, so she had a record of it. And she said that she saw a man who saw tomorrow, and she realized it was important. A beam of light descended, and this story for her began kind of like she was watching a movie. There was a dark, curly-haired young man who was the Antichrist. It was around 1999, during the reign of the Antichrist. And they said that the number 666 and 999 are reversed, that 1999 is the year of the Antichrist for that reason. Then she was shown a young boy with long blonde hair who would reign after the Antichrist. And she was told in this dream that it was a divine revelation, and don't just tell it to anybody. She awoke and wrote it down. She knew it was special, but she didn't, I don't know why she didn't connect it with canon. The young boy, of course, was the great genius that Nostradamus predicted after the Antichrist, who brings the world back from the brink of destruction. Cynthia did not know anything about Nostradamus till she had this dream. Actually, she saw, after this, she saw a documentary about him, and then she told Canon about the dream. Many people contacted Canon after books 1 and 2 were published, saying that they were getting information in dreams, and some of them in meditation, and some of them just randomly. So Canon says it's in the ether now. It's accessible to anybody who can do those sorts of connections. If you're sensitive, you can receive it. So her question is, are we creating a receiver? Canon decided to try a guy called Wayne, who was a quiet carpenter in his late 30s. He was a good subject, but he had trouble reading, and he had a limited vocabulary. He was very mechanically minded, so he was willing to talk with Nostradamus about that sort of thing. So Canon chose a quatrain for the first time at a session where a subject was completely ignorant of what was going on. I mean, he knew they were going to do something, but he didn't know the topic. She was the reporter, the subject was the messenger, and in the session, Wayne went into a trance, into an incarnate state. He saw colorful strands all over radiating from a central bright light. He saw globes of light, which were spirits. One came up to him, it was his guide, and asked, to help. He asked it for help to reach Nostradamus. He saw a black hole, which was a porthole. He went into it, and the bright light, the spirit guide, went with him. He felt safe. He emerged into a room. The black hole is on the other side of a mirror on a desk. And Wayne comes out into the room through the mirror. Nostradamus is sitting at the desk, so Nostradamus drew him, of course. Cannon realized the contact is made with permission of everybody concerned, including spirit guides. Without permission, no contact. It's not in her hands. She provides the subject, that's it. Nostradamus was younger this time. He didn't have a beard, and she found that in his diaries later, as a young man, he had not been having visions then. He did them when he was older. So Wayne described the familiar room and realized Nostradamus sees him as an aura of sort of a light spirit. Nostradamus knows why they're there, but he's only had a year to work on the quatrains. He says this work is his destiny, that he would squander his gift if he didn't use it. He tried Wayne with a quatrain that they'd done before. They used the quatrain about a discovery that was similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not the Dead Sea Scrolls. It happened in 1995, and it talks about new technology. That was found, and then again in 2017 and 2021, they were found. More writings were found. In 94 and 95, there were huge controversies on who had the right to dig, who had the right to keep artifacts, and all these projects were stopped. And this had to do with governments and factions and civil unrest. The Middle East, and a lot of Jewish, Islamic, and Christian hassling over who owned what. And if you remember, a while ago we read about a board being formed, of an ecumenical board to study these writings that were found, the first set that were found, and first set that was found, and they got taken and hidden, and nobody can see them now. So God only knows, literally, what's on these things. So this session was really positive, and it reassured Cannon, it reassured Nostradamus, and it proved that they could work with Wayne. Wayne feared he was making it all up from his own imagination. He didn't know about the quatrains ahead of time. He got bored. He thought it was too time consuming, and he didn't have that level of interest. So Dolores thought maybe she could do these sessions with more than one person, so working more often but with different people. So chapter 4, the former teacher. A woman named Pam, a former teacher, was aware of the experiment. She knew that Dolores was up to something, but she didn't know it was about Nostradamus. She felt she volunteered, and under trance she felt that she was floating among colorful wisps, and she kept wanting to call it plasma. She said she could hear and feel indescribable music. She felt she was surrounded by wisps of spirits and was protected, and she was able to ask for a guide. She could look down on the earth and see this is really interesting, an infinite number of tubes coming up from the earth with different densities and brightnesses, and they were people's outward focus. So when you meditate, for example, and they're easier to find, people are easier to find on the earth if their focus is put outward. And it made me think of people who consciously have seen UFOs quickly and consciously want to be in contact and are able to actually make it happen by focusing on it. So Pamela found Nostradamus at his table. He was staring into a dish of water with a quill. Remember, he made waves in the water and it did things for him. She got his attention by flickering his candle. She put out love to him. He perceived that she was a friend, and he said, "I know you're there." Pam says he's a very serious guy. He's burdened with the weight of the world on his shoulders. And Nostradamus made some comment like, "Oh, look, somebody else from the future." She asked him, "Are you married?" And he said, "No woman will have me." Okay. And she asked why, and he said, well, that should be obvious. He says that women fill up the air with words. They're always demanding that something be done. They're never satisfied. They don't like the hours he keeps or his own personal habits. They want to talk about trivial, meaningless details, on and on and on. It's not that any female has personally injured him or damaged him. He just simply refrains from keeping their company and is disgusted by it when he's around it. He's into more intelligent things, which is, boy, talk about blaming the victim. Deny women an education and then blame them for not being educated. Don't get me started. So anyway, he got disgusted often with Cannon when she repeated her questions or asked him to explain. He expected people to pick up on it right away. The only real interaction he has with people is with his patients. He has very little contact with peers. He's an oddball. His quest is like a jealous lover, very little time for the mundane world, is how he put it. He focuses not on his family, but on inward solitary pursuits. But he hasn't published anything yet. He doesn't have the interest. His puzzles are only puzzles for some people, he says. He's writing from feeling and intuition. He only sees the edges, and it's often not always clear to him. He has a heavy urge and sense of responsibility to get this stuff out there. Nostradamus says many teachings of the church will be shown to be false and self-serving. The teachings that prove this will be discovered after the Dead Sea Scrolls, but similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's probably why they're hiding them. They will reveal the truths from the ancients that were rejected as heresy and blasphemy. The old sect saw more accurately, and it was twisted by those in power. Now, he's specifically talking about the Vatican. Change is foretold from the ancient past, and it will come out as truth. Pam is able to get Nostradamus to see her as a long-haired woman in a robe. She also was able to explain some of his symbols. In his quatrains, he used things as symbology. For example, talking about a mother and child, he was talking about countries. She says he's very driven. Nostradamus says to think of the quatrains as probable futures and not the only future possible. And he kept trying to reassure people. This is what could happen. Worst case scenario, do something about it. Pam says it's difficult for Nostradamus, because he would need to hear the quatrains in the original from the Old French, Greek, Latin, and in the code. And the French in Cannon's book that she has that she's reading from is not really what he wrote. And Cannon doesn't speak French, let alone Old French. She doesn't know Latin or Greek. So the next session, Pam's spirit flies to Nostradamus's window like a bird, and she sees Nostradamus at his desk, and he senses her. He has talked to the king, a man ill-qualified to be king, for whom he has no respect or admiration. The queen is mean and tells the king nothing. She believes Nostradamus. Nostradamus does not think that women are fully human. He's disdainful of the entire royal court. They have the power of life and death, and he knows that he's superior to all of them. I think he means intellectually and spiritually. He does have a student of healing who also uses alchemy and is spiritual. He says he's had a number of students. There's one who the world knows about later, whose name is Chauvigny, but he calls him Mr. Ego. Nostradamus hopes people in the future will regard him with kindness and thanks. He is not a charlatan. He wants people to know he's not a charlatan. He always had good intent. He doesn't know how or why it works, but all his messages that he received are true. He has experimented with plants to open up his psyche. He's not hallucinating. He's used morning glory, angelica, the seeds of some kind of white flower. He says that in general with plants, their beauty, aroma, and nectar actually point to subtle energies of plants that can be helpful to people in small amounts. His experiments with plants and seeds on himself were guided by entities. He said some poisonous plants are okay in small amounts to increase your awareness. He can leave his body, go into the spirit world and be a time traveler. And he said he has no room for fear, but he wasn't afraid because he saw the future and knew he was still alive and the plant didn't kill him. He uses some plants to heal in the etheric realm as well as the physical realm. Chapter 5, the light being. He has a new subject. Canon has a new subject as well as Pam called Nina. And she does a new session with Nina, who goes into the spirit state between lives, sees a golden light and surrounded by floating energy patterns. She sees a robed female light being. She has form but's not solid. Is it her guide? Is it come to help? Dolores asks Nina, are you able to look at living persons on Earth? And Nina says, if I ask, I can. Dolores describes Nostradamus, and Nina is there immediately. He feels he has a heavy burden, according to Nina. He's mixing powders using a kind of a recipe book, which is full of remedies for healing. Nina describes Nostradamus. She knows that he heals and teaches and is burdened. She's not able to get his attention. He has about 8 to 10 students at a time. They rarely get together at the same time. They are focusing individually on different areas of study, and they'll get together in smaller groups for those particular areas. They study things way beyond the physical to heal people better. They are meeting in the schoolroom below the house, and Nostradamus is gazing into a glass-like mirror. Nina knows that she has to wait until he's alone. The first woman light being guide is able to get Nostradamus' attention and tell him that his words will survive and to be at peace. And then Nina communicates through this guide and is shown so much that she's not even able to process it for canon. We will be led to see the cover-up of a space program and space stations that's actually going on now. That false photos of the planets have been given to the public, and that there are space stations and vehicles on the moon, and that's a very common conspiracy theory. There are people who really argue that pretty intensely with pictures and stuff. It's very interesting. There's only one holy philosophy. The people of the earth will come together in one universal sect of good with a new awareness in the future. The guide shows Nostradamus that destiny can be controlled and changed. There's a purpose to all the awful events that we're experiencing. It's a cleansing. There's a reason for us to be here at this time. These are all messages that Nostradamus is getting. This guide began to filter the negative stuff out that was overwhelming Nina, and this was a different path, and it was a denial of the real prophecy, and the guide eliminated it. Dolores had to explain to the guide that Nostradamus' purpose was to reveal the worst case, so the guide was trying to sugarcoat things, the spirit guide, and for Nina's benefit. And Canon had to negotiate with her and tell her, no, the purpose here is to be frank. We can't prevent what we don't know is coming. The previous interpretations of these quatrains that people had done, the translations were taken very literally. When he said brother, mother, sister, they thought they were talking about, that Nostradamus was talking about human relationships, but he was really talking about allied nations. He said it's full of deep symbolism and you can't take these literally. Out of her trance, Nina said that it was a strange experience because she was flooded with so many images all at the same time. She said that Nostradamus was kind, but worn out, used up. In a dream later, she saw that Nostradamus was in despair over ignorance and arrogance of humankind and in pain of hopelessness. She found that Nostradamus, young, was a daring, curious, and excited person, and older, he was frustrated. He had developed arthritis from sitting so long in cold stone rooms. Cannon used Wayne, Pam, and Nina at the same time. Not together, but simultaneously. They were all having their own separate sessions with her. Wayne and then Nina quit. Pam began working on a different part of the project, so once again, Cannon was in need of a subject. Chapter 6, Brenda returns. So after 2 years, after finding an easier job, remember she was working, I think, in a chicken plant or something, Brenda got an easier job, was going back to school, was more rested and less stressed out, and she agreed to come back and help. In her first new session, she went to the special meeting place with Nostradamus, and there was a table that was built in, that had built-in information in its molecules. Knowledge could appear as words on the tabletop. It almost sounds like a computer screen. And that sometimes the picture would float over it like a Star Trek thing. Brenda and Nostradamus discuss the music of the spheres. The path of the planets make music in the ether. And this was a belief of the ancient Greek Archimedes. And of course, the church put a stop to it. Brenda says it's true. It's at a frequency that human ears normally can't hear. It has to do with mathematics of planetary position and movement relative to the sun. It just makes total sense in physics. We just need a device to pick it up and we could hear it. Nostradamus showed her deep space and she said it was beautiful. He said that the Inquisition was ignorant, that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and that the study of planets detracts from the study of God, the glory of God. Nostradamus says that God is wisdom and understanding. His knowledge of the future is part of knowing God. Church placing man in the center made restrictions on the deity. In the pursuit of knowledge, there's no such thing as heresy. Anything you try to understand, any knowledge you try to gain, you may be misunderstanding it, but it's not heretical to pursue it. His talent is a gift from God, but it's up to him to use it for good. The future visions, he says, don't come from God. They're possibilities. That's a distinction I'm not sure I entirely understood. He said God is knowledge without human form. That a lot of narrow-minded and ignorant people are everywhere you go. Didn't take a psychic to figure that out. He said time is flexible. Nostradamus admits that he gets discouraged, that he's sad, that his own children simply don't understand his work. He says as he got older, he was forced to disguise the quatrains even more. He didn't decide to do it to be difficult. He said he had to do it. And he wanted them to survive long enough to get out as much information as possible when the time was right and people were open to understanding it. So they worked together for 4 years and finished the last one in July of 1990. Now we're on section 2 of the book, The Information. So this is what Dolores Cannon calls 20 years of the present, meaning the late 80s to the early 2000s. We don't know. Time is just really hard to determine. Chapter 7, Nostradamus' healing methods. Now this is really interesting. It's going to make a lot of people really happy to hear this stuff, because I know for a fact that I've heard from people who do all kinds of alternative healing stuff, and you're going to like this. So he was feared by the superstitious people of his times because he was able to heal things other people couldn't hear. He said that the medicine of the time was primitive. The people believed disease was a punishment from God. He would have been remembered as a great healer if people had not been so stupid. He experimented with untried methods and it freaked them out. They thought he was in league with the devil. He just was ahead of his time in understanding mind, body, and healing. He used way more plants and way fewer chemicals than other doctors of his time. He used hypnosis, mind control over pain. That was considered witchcraft. He used acupressure. He would, this is weird, I thought, but he did it. He would suffocate somebody until the person passed out, and then he could sew them up really fast while they were unconscious. I guess he could control it. He worked with energy centers. He worked with auras. And he worked with chakras, and he knew all about this stuff, which a lot of people in his time did not know. He got the knowledge from meditating. He said it came from a higher plane. He healed plague by, now we're talking about Nostradamus, and we're talking about the Black Death, and he reportedly balanced energies of people's auras using his own aura and movement to open and close chakras. And clockwise movement would open them, counterclockwise movement would close them, and he would put the body in balance. And he said the body heals itself when you manipulate the aura and the chakras. He didn't use secret medication. His treatments were energy work, and nobody understood it at this time. He knew how to slow the heartbeat and the blood flow to treat the whole person. He could put people in a state of suspension, actually. He received visions and voices, and he actually cut himself to practice healing techniques. And he was able to manipulate energy. Chapter 8, Nostradamus as a young man. He had no control over the timing of, they had no control over the timing of when they would enter his life. They never knew if they were going to find young Nostradamus or old Nostradamus or something in between. They realized when they appeared to a younger one, he didn't know much about them or the quatrains. The younger he was, the less he knew, and there were times when he knew nothing. They could not even contact him when he was really young because he was shut down. His subjects preferred being around the young Nostradamus because he was more fun and lighthearted. The old Nostradamus was a prisoner of his own making, obsessed by his visions. Pam's sessions were with the younger Nostradamus, and they gave glimpses of how he had evolved. She saw him on his way to visit a girlfriend. He said, "I'm a man in love." He was walking down the street. You could read this in his brain. The girlfriend worked at a nearby apothecary. But then he began to have prophetic dreams that he didn't understand. Another visit from Pam was in his study when he was very young. And he said he had visions and heard voices since childhood, didn't know what to make of them. And as he matured, he realized he also had external visitors from another dimension. He told her he was born with sixth sense. And he received a book from his grandfather. His grandfather was into Jewish ritual magic. And he received a book of incantations. It's actually a Wiccan book. And he learned to read how to get rid of what he conjured up. So he looked at this book and he memorized it, and he learned how to conjure entities, and if they were awful, to get rid of them immediately. He says he does not use dark spells. He doesn't believe in doing that. He says he believed that his grandfather found this old book of sacred Jewish magic dated from the Romans when they captured the temple in Jerusalem. He memorized his books of magic and burned them to keep them out of the wrong hands, people who would misuse them. He has had many spirit visitors. People after life keep the same fears and untruths that they have in the incarnate state. That's kind of a bummer. He has to be careful to be discerning about who he talks with. I keep changing tense. Sometimes I talk like it's the past, and then because in the context of the book, that's what she does. So he has to be careful to be discerning. He can do automatic writing and visualize things easily. He gets messages from a higher plane, and he claims himself on a higher plane helps him. Lots of the quatrains information has been coming to him for a long time, sometimes 30 years or more, and he's just been storing it up. Pam sees Nostradamus 35 to 40, successfully able to conjure up an entity. The stench was horrible. It was just a weird shape that smelled, and he immediately got rid of it. And the ritual of getting rid of it involved washing his hands, and he told her that water is sacred. Sorry. He burned something in a bowl and recited words. She doesn't know what language it was, and he did it 3 times, and then he took a deep breath and he blew the entity away. It just disappeared. He told her that it was fun for him to experiment and see how much he could do. The next time she came, he was eating at a table with his wife and daughter at the far opposite ends. They were having bread, cheese, and apples. And he told Pam, this is her house. I'm the master of my mind. He says, I have the Son inside of me and the Father. She says he sometimes speaks in riddles, and he's disdainful of other people, kind of an intellectual snob. He's shut off from humans. He doesn't think like other people think. He doesn't think linearly the way the rest of us does. Our thoughts, the way the rest of us do. His thoughts go in multiple directions at one time. And he has to use telepathy because he's just not able to put it into a linear speech. He's able to dump it telepathically. Chapter 9, quatrains dealing with the past. Nostradamus said to be a true astrologer, you have to have psychic understanding. There's more to it than just knowing how the charts work and the signs and that kind of thing. So then he started talking about his predictions, the future for him, but our past. He talked about USSR and allies in World War II. He sees many alternative ways that things can go, but there's nothing unique under the sun. He sees a grand future perspective, and it's always repeated because we don't seem to learn. It's sometimes hard to recognize my own work in the translations, he says. He predicted that Lincoln would be shot for challenging the slave trade. He saw the death of JFK and Martin Luther King and RFK. They were good people, and they had truth, and they were killed for trying to enlighten people. And he said you can't judge people by their, their affairs. He said that there's goodness and there's human fallibility, and it's 2 different things. He said the associates John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy with Lincoln as truth bringers, very important souls. He discusses the murder of Anwar Sadat. He said that he was in the same league as Kennedy's and Martin Luther King because he was willing to do the right thing for peace against the majority hate. He pushed for peace and love, and it was all stopped by dark forces. He predicted Watergate. He said Nixon escaped accountability by quitting. He said that this event, the lack of accountability for Nixon, would have profound, long-lasting effects on the American political system. It would have major consequences decades and centuries later. So think about that. He said during the Inquisition, people of knowledge were persecuted, books were burned, and the cycle would repeat. He said, he's a snob about French pronunciation. He predicted the rise of the British Empire over the French. And he said the French did have an empire. He predicted the fall of the Spanish Armada, the Navy versus pirates. The sun will never set on the British Empire. He used that phrase. He said the British Empire won't last forever, that the colonies would take their independence. He said some people debate his translations, but they're wrong. He predicts that America and France would both have revolutions that would be related to French philosophers inspiring the American Revolution. And that's exactly what happened. History develops in spirals, and quatrains of his often overlap time periods. So he said that some of this stuff is disjointed from itself. She just collated a bunch of stuff together. So kind of hopping around here in time periods and topics. He said that the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea were both formed by meteors hitting the Earth, and that they're still in the seabed. He predicted the War of 1812. He talked about Hitler breaking treaties and stealing gold, he said, even from people's teeth. He talked about the Allies rescuing Europe, that World War I and World War II were a strong nexus, that they radically changed the direction of the Earth. Secret nuclear research has been going on since World War II. It's still going on. He talked about collaborators and partisans in the war. He predicts Chernobyl, and he said that there would not be enough water to cool, and that would be why that there would be this accident, and that radioactivity would spread much worse than what the government ever wanted to admit. He predicted prohibition of alcohol in the United States and the U.S. Depression. He talked about the United States breaking with England was mainly economic. England wanted to stop slavery and the United States didn't. He saw the American Civil War and the French being friendly with the South in order to keep trade in cotton. Because of cotton cloth, they're into fashion. He talked about Union blockades of ports. He talked about the English at Dunkirk in World War II. And eventually England will work with old allies in Asia from the old British Empire against the Antichrist. He discussed Mussolini. He said Hitler printed money without having anything to back it. Now this is, mind you, he predicted this in the 1500s, so for him it was the future. The leaders of the Weimar Republic wanted Hitler out. He talks about a false one-armed man, meaning the Hitler salute. He told where Hitler was born. He described the chimneys of deaths at the camps. He said the camps, he described them. And then he talked about there would be people who would plot to kill Hitler. That the Germans were doing, the Nazis were doing secret research into heavy water. He talked about the secrets of the atomic bomb development and how the scientists were morally reluctant. He described Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He saw pilots, planes, weatherproof clothing, people fleeing to the water because of the radiation in both places. He says he uses a lot of Greek myths and allegory. He said that leaders had mixed feelings about dropping the atomic bombs. Would they drop the bomb or would the war drag on? But he said the bombs had a terribly negative effect on the fabric of time. Layers of similar timelines are the French Revolution, World War I and II, and the rise of the Antichrist. So I'm going to stop here because this is the start of a new chapter, so it's a good place to stop the video. And that's the end of number 1, and I'll be back in a minute with video number 2.